Great. Okay, so I realize this is the end of the day. It's gonna be quick, so I'm just gonna sort of share various examples, comments, observations, questions from this been very enjoyable workshop. I have not slept very well the last couple of days, mainly because I've been so intellectually stimulated. I really have not slept because I've just been thinking about this stuff all night, and it's nice and annoying, especially when you have kids. So the challenge of coming up with the outline or how I'm going to prepare this talk, I thought of it this way: is that there's sort of a lot of different points that I'd like to make. That's kind of the vertical axis, and the horizontal axis are, you can think of like all the different themes that are floating around. And I would, you need to try to order the presentation of those themes. As I learned, you can then establish some sort of a KL distance between these different, if you think of these as different observations, some sort of similarity measure. You can make the minimum spanning tree. You can use the sequencer to try to make a linear ordering over this. And then you make a talk that makes you look like a genius. I tried to do that, but the code, I couldn't find the code, so sorry. And then I also got kind of skeptical when I looked back at Linka's talk because I thought, okay, we have sort of in topics, that adjacency matrix between all the different related points that I'd like to make is big. If there's some probability of me trying to make one of those points, there's sort of known algorithms for making this talk finish in 25 minutes, and then there's kind of impossibility bounds. So I sort of gave up because I know that I'm well beyond the phase transition of what's possible. So I'm going to focus mainly on, I think, where my heart is in this topic, but it really hits many of the different issues. So if we're trying to put together machine learning and physics, what is it that we do as physicists? I mean, I think we can probably agree that there's two major things that we do, and roughly on the theoretical direction, we come up with models that make predictions about the data. That's sort of a forward generative model of what's going on. And then say it more as experimentalists, if you will, we observe the data and we try to do inference and we try to learn about the parameters of those models. And then our simulators and the different tools and things that we come up with, they are basically establishing a statistical model of the data given those parameters. I separated out parameters that I care about, which would be things like cosmological constants, Higgs boson masses, things like that, from nuisance parameters, which would be things like calibration constants in my detector and things like that, which will affect the data, but I don't necessarily care what their variable values are. And I also separated out latent variables from the parameters that I want to infer. I'm thinking about latent variables that in a kind of frequentist sense, I could imagine have some random distribution. I just don't get to observe them. So like in the history of the formation of our solar system, I can imagine where all the rocks and things were along the way. That's somehow like a meaningful concept, but I don't get to observe them, right? So this is kind of the picture that I have in mind. And then there's lots of examples. So here are a few examples that we've heard about from sort of on the more fundamental kind of end of physics. So you've got CMB power spectra from cosmology, LHC particle physics, in-body simulations of the universe with gravitational dynamics. Usually the way that like physicists approach this is that we think really hard. We come up with some. You have a lot of insight into the data generation process, and we come up with summary statistics of that complicated data. So here's the power spectrum of the CMB. Here's this histogram of a one-dimensional summary statistic for all the LHC collisions that was what we used to discover the Higgs. Over there is another power spectrum. And that's usually how we sort of go about doing the inference. Of course, that requires that you have a good idea of what's a useful and powerful summary statistic. So the thing that I'm kind of excited about in terms of where all this is going and how it might affect physics is that how can we go beyond the sort of typical summary statistic approach? So we have these simulators, and they have an exquisite amount of detail inside of them. And if you want to impose domain knowledge on something, the simulator is like the richest form that we could know how to do that. I mean, we can write code with all sorts of details, and we can model the situation till our heart's content. The problem is that those tend to be intractable. So one way of saying it, if you thought about the gravitational interaction, the interaction between two particles is very simple, but you got a bunch of them in an in-body simulation, and the aggregate effect of all of those simulations makes it very, very difficult, and you have an intractable inverse problem. And so I think one of the things that's happening in machine learning is that you can use that simulator to generate a bunch of data, and you can learn from it because it's like free labeled training data. And what you can try to do is sort of connect the microscopic and macroscopic divide, where you're describing essentially you're coming up with an effective statistical model for the data, which maybe only has the relevant degrees of freedom. So it's some kind of macroscopic emergent phenomena that you're modeling, but it's tied back to the parameters that describe the low-level mechanistic microscopic model. And Nobel Prizes have been many have been awarded for people just coming up with an effective model at some new scale. I mean, if you can model the phenomena at a scale, and no one knew how to do that before, that's a big deal, and you get your name attached to it. And if you can make the bridge between the lower level scale to the higher level scale, then that's like really big deal. So if you could start to do this in a more systematic way with machine learning ideas, that would be big. So here's another example of a simulator. We saw some of these. This has to do with field theory. So these could be like statistical mechanics problems, like the Ising model, or they could be more elaborate things like quantum chromodynamics. And this is a little video of like the quark and gluon fields fluctuating. And you can put that on a computer. These are enormously complicated simulations. And somewhere hiding in there are, you see the emergence from quarks and gluons to protons and neutrons and pions and all those things, right? So if you could somehow discover the phenomena at that scale and tie it back to the parameters of fundamental QCD, that would be a big deal. Okay. So the only possibility I think that we're going to ever have of doing this, which is maybe never going to be possible anyways, would be if we like exploit inductive bias. And I think we've heard a lot about this ideas of compositionality, symmetry, separation of scales. This is what I worked on last night, making this clever diagram. We had a lot of great talks about ideas along these lines. And so I'm going to give just a couple little examples along the way. The other thing that we didn't hear a lot about is in machine learning, if you wanted to broadly characterize different approaches to machine learning, there's a sort of discriminative models and generative models. And this is a slide from Maxwellian. I like it a lot because on the left you see deep learning. And on the right, you see sort of the typical generative models, and then properties below. And over on the right, you see a lot of things that physicists care about, like being able to inject expert knowledge, to be able to model causal relationships, to be interpretable, data efficient, robust to domain shift. That's as an experimentalist what I would call like robust to systematic uncertainties, and all these things. So I want all the properties on the right, and deep learning is kind of over here on the left. And but it's very successful and accurate, and it tends to work very well on, for instance, like supervised learning problems. Of course, it's still a mystery, why it works as well as it does, and we had several talks along those lines about trying to understand that and how physics can influence that. They're not really mutually exclusive, so there is an overlap, and I think a lot of the, there's a lot of work in the intersection recently, and that's, to me, one of the areas where I'm very excited. Okay, so just because there's not enough time, I'm going to pick an example. So I'm going to talk about jets at the LHC. When you collide protons at the LHC at very high energies, usually what you get out are these things called jets because they came from quarks and gluons. Those are the things that you make the most often. It's a big spray of particles that's like roughly collimated. This is what they look like. What's the generative model, right? So again, this is like it's beyond just a normal generative model in the statistical sense. It's a causal one because it has a whole story about how you got there. So we're starting with first principles theory of the standard model, which is it's written down, quantum field theory. You have a way of systematically approximating that. You see things like Feynman diagrams. That only describes sort of like quarks and things flying out, and those are not physical. We don't get to see them. And instead, there's another process that happens where they radiate like crazy, and that's a very complicated process. And that's kind of the bluish color. And then there's another process which is called hadronization, which is not even calculable. It's a non-perturbative thing, but I can measure it in some other experiments, and there's some hope that it's a universal phenomena, so the measurements in other experiments can be translated over here. But there's all this kind of compositional stages of and this is how we simulate it. And then those little green dots at the end are like physical particles that come flying through and they smack into my detector. And then I have to model how they bend through magnetic fields and ionized silicon and all of the stuff that goes on. And then deposit energy in roughly 100 million sensors of my detector. And there's in the simulations, there's roughly 1 billion latent variables to simulate one LHC collision, and we've had 10 to the 15 collisions at the LHC. So, and so we can't work with that raw data because it's too complicated. So then we usually start to summarize it through a bunch of deterministic algorithms that take the data and try to summarize it. Okay. So here's like a rough graphical model for like what's going on. There's some theory parameters out at the top. There's a plate here, a data plate with 10 to the 15 collisions. Then inside of that, you have the kind of this process of going from like the Feynman diagram to the spray of the little green things to the green particles hitting my detector to my actual sensor readouts, and we simulate this whole thing. And now you can ask, how is it that physicists have done this at all before machine learning, right? So we've succeeded, and we've succeeded partially because we exploit the symmetries and the compositionality and all of these things. So, and this is interesting, is that it's not, we don't try to go from sensor data to is there a Higgs boson and one big black box, step, right? We go kind of sequentially, and so we have, here's just adding labels again. These Z's are sort of the latent variables of the process. X is my observed data. Then we run these algorithms that go from X to different, intermediate stages, but we align those intermediate stages so that we can think of them as essentially point estimates of the latent states. And then, so there's a correspondence between what's going on in the latent generative process and the sequential, reconstruction is what we call it. And the thing that's important about that is that by having this inversion, we can then look at things like what's the distribution of my point estimate, say, for one of these intermediate latent states compared to like its true value, which I can access in the simulator. And then I can kind of validate each one of those pieces. I can characterize the performance of all of those pieces. And I can, they're also usually thought of as kind of universal in the sense that an electron is an electron is an electron. So if I can understand it in one place, I know what it's like in another place. So it's, I have this kind of reusable transfer learning idea. And it also provides this very practical and actionable notion of interpretability. It's not like, explain to me your decision. It's more like, as a scientist, I can go, characterize my electron reconstruction efficiency and, energy resolution or something like that. And so this is how we've succeeded, right? And so I think we don't want to throw away this paradigm, but we want to supercharge it with some machine learning ideas. So I'm not going to go through this slide because it's text heavy, but the rough point here is that I think a conservative approach to attacking the problem would be don't throw away everything with deep learning, but re-implement the entire reconstruction pipeline in a auto-differentiable programming language so that I can backprop through that whole process and optimize the whole thing. And there was a push a little bit ago about saying, well, maybe deep learning has outlived its usefulness as a name, and maybe we should think of it as differentiable programming. And so I have this kind of a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. So I think you get some pushback when you talk to physicists about some of these things, because if you describe this, you'd be like, well, that's not deep learning. That's just, but whatever. I don't care what you call it. But this is one approach, right? The other approach is you still think of this compositional story, but you start to replace it with like neural networks and things. So I'm going to give an example of that. So, okay, and yeah, time. Okay, so we saw this lovely diagram from Linka. I think certainly picture's been in the back of my mind. I think many people's mind about this interaction between the algorithm and the data and the architecture. We had several talks about, for instance, from Nadia talking about the interaction between the architecture and the data. And sorry, I meant to say the algorithm. Excuse me. Yeah. But there's another point here, which I think is interesting. It's not so much the data structure, but the data generating process. If you have an idea of what the data generating process looks like, that's certainly going to help inform what your architecture might look like. Because it's like if you can make the architecture kind of mirror that, maybe it will work out. So let's go back to this jet example. I have this picture of like there was a quark or a gluon, and it split and radiated and split and split and split. And so I was talking to Kung-Yun Cho, who does natural language processing, and I was watching his talks about parse trees and things, and I was like, wow, that looks kind of similar. If I make this analogy between words and particles hitting my detector and this parse tree to what we would call a jet algorithm, which is this sequential recombination algorithm that tries to invert the whole process, then that looks cool. So we did it, and so here we have something that's a classical physics algorithm that takes those particles, produces that tree, and that's the architecture of my neural network. And then I recursively apply some, neuron across it, which makes sense because my data generation process is a stationary Markov process, right? So it actually makes sense to reuse the weights over and over again. And then I can use different weights at the bottom because I think there's different physics at the bottom, and I can use different weights at the top because I think there's different physics going on at the top. And when we do that and we start to work kind of natively with the data instead of these kind of forced into an image-based representation, which is what people were doing before, this is like a rock curve with a 1 over instead. So this is this is like how many. This was a binary classification problem that we were trying to solve, and this is a big jump in improvement. That's a log scale, so we got a factor of 7 or 8 something improvement compared to previous approaches. And one thing that's nice here is it used way less data to train, and it also is well, it looks like the physics that I think it should. So recently, people have been working on this project. That we put out a comparison paper with a benchmark data set on a bunch of different approaches. This work was 2 years ago, and we haven't really touched it since then. In the meantime, various people have been trying all sorts of residual networks. Particle net is like a point cloud type network. And basically, within errors, ours is working as well as anything. And the interesting point, we use whatever 30,000 parameters instead of 1.5 million parameters, right? And we can also train with like orders of magnitude less data. So there's one of the places where you're not, we're probably nearly saturating performance, and but we can do it much more efficiently. So this is the bonus of having inductive bias. And then you can do the same kind of story where you start to compose this in the same way, where these are sort of particles going into jets, going into all the jets in an event, and then I start trying to do event level classification. And so this is starting to take off in particle physics, and I sort of like this direction. One point here is that there's a little bit of a tension between two of the themes of this talk. Is on one side, you want this inductive bias to try to make the models as kind of, small as possible. In some sense, the latent state, could be as small as like a 4-component vector, because it only really depends on the 4 momentum of that quark or gluon, and then like one other number to say what type of particle it was. So maybe my latent state should only be like a 5-dimensional, but they don't work well if they're 5-dimensional. You need like a 50-dimensional latent state. And so that's probably related to the fact that the optimization, is much harder for whatever reasons, these issues about over-parameterized things and stuff. So this would be nice to understand better. Okay, now what about symmetries? I haven't said anything about symmetries, and part of the point is that at the level of observed experimental data, usually those symmetries are broken. Like energy conservation and momentum conservation does not exist in my observed data because I have measurement error on each of those components, and there's no rotational symmetry because I have to hold up my detector with some big, steel things that are on the bottom, and Lorentz invariance is broken because I'm in the lab frame. So the idea of symmetries, I think, is important, but it's probably going to be more important to put that kind of stuff in the generative process, and like the describing like some latent generative process. Okay, now because of time, I'm gonna kind of flip over this, but we've done various things also with graph neural networks instead of trees. So here's a picture of a jet where each little dot is a particle hitting you, and the size of the circle is like how much energy it has. And this admits a kind of natural graph representation. The thing that's cool is that the adjacency matrix, we have a very natural notion of distance between particles that knows about not only special relativity, but also about like in QCD, the singularity structure of how things like to radiate and stuff. And so over on the right is like the adjacency matrix for this thing. So this has actually led to a whole new way of actually thinking about and representing jets. And what's cool is that this representation makes sense outside of deep learning. This makes sense as just me as a physicist. But now I can either use this as like an API between me as a physicist and my brain and the neural network architecture. And so I can either inject physics knowledge into the architecture because I know something about physics, or I can loosen this requirement and learn the adjacency matrix, and then I can export it and look to see what it is and maybe learn something about what's going on from the data. And I can use that in another context that has nothing to do with deep learning. So I think that's another example of a kind of actionable level of interpretability that's really, it's like an artifact of the learning that I can do something with. So I think this theme of establishing APIs between the architecture, and some other kind of domain-specific application is, probably has legs. Okay, here's some work from Jesse Thaler and company where they used a deep set type architecture. One interesting thing is they basically came up with this architecture on their own, and then they realized, oh, yeah, someone's already done that. But here they have these crazy visualizations where they're basically looking at each one of the particles, and as they move around kind of compared to the axis of this jet, they're visualizing the response in the embedding space, and they get all these psychedelic looking drawings. But you see there's small circles in the middle and big circles on the outside, and then they make this kind of plot of the area of that embedding. It's like the receptive field of each one of those, sort of latent dimensions versus how far you are from the axis. And there's a scaling law that is actually basically what you would predict from QCD in terms of like if you wanted to kind of partition the space equally. It's like in some metric those are all uniform circles, and they see that. So it's another example of a kind of like interpretability, which is what you get from basically the inductive bias. So this was one of Ben's slides. It was basically talking about these ideas of interpretability, and I really liked some of these points that it's not just solving the task. After you solve the task, you would like to then have some insight about what to do next, and the idea that there's some narrative that goes along with it. And I think I agree with that point. Okay, now I'm like halfway through, but that's not going to happen. Anyways, okay, so back to this picture, I talked about kind of the discriminative side. Let me switch to the generative side. So I think, if you say generative model now, probably 7 in 10 chance that you're going to think GANs. So, here GANs, we've all seen them. They make birds, they make volcanoes, they make celebrity faces. It's exciting. You can also make pictures of galaxies, universes. The bottom thing on the right is like a detector, at the LHC. So it's great. One kind of provocative question is from a computer scientist point of view, it's a huge success that the same model can model volcanoes and galaxies, right? But but from an inductive bias point of view, maybe that's not so good, right? Like maybe you don't want the model class to be so flexible. You would like to restrict it to only do galaxy-looking things. And then, of course, the way that they're trained is that, that you have like a bunch of random noise, you pipe it through a neural network, which is some very nonlinear function, and you make the output of the neural network be the space of your data. And if you could evaluate the sort of the probability density of getting one of those outputs, then you would have the likelihood, you would just train these things through maximum likelihood. But because that neural network is not invertible, you can't calculate the likelihood. We were hearing earlier about that in terms of like the role of optimal transport and stuff. So there are different approaches to try to train this, and this is where the adversary comes in. It basically looks at the difference between the generated data and the real data and says like, now I can tell the difference between them. So it's sort of like a counterfeiter and the detective trying to tell the difference between them, and they have this mini-max adversarial game. And the Nash equilibrium basically should give you the right distribution. Okay, so that's great. And if you've seen a talk on GANs, you've probably seen this quote from Feynman. And since we're at a physics conference, you have to say it. But I think what's really interesting here, it's very seductive to think I have a GAN. It can make stuff that looks like my real data. So my network has learned physics, right? But I don't really buy that too much. So one of the main points is that the only thing that the GAN is doing for sure is learning statistical correlations. The fact that it can do it is amazing, right? But there's a big gap between learning like a joint distribution and having like the causal story that our physical models have, right? So our physical models have this very rich causal story about how you got there. And now sort of switching gears a little bit, if I look at like here's a simulated thing, the commonality between my physical simulator and a GAN is that it also has a totally intractable likelihood. If I wanted to calculate the likelihood of a particular observation, I would have to integrate over the, whatever trillion dimensional latent space that could give me that observation, and that's like totally intractable. So if you want to do inference in the context of this statistical model that's implicitly defined by my simulator, you're kind of out of luck, right? So what are you going to do? And this is what motivates this whole topic of what's sometimes called likelihood-free inference. Maybe simulation-based inference would be a better name. But the idea is you have a simulator, it can generate things in the forward mode, but it has an intractable likelihood. So how do you go about doing it? This topic has been picked up, and this is a workshop at ICML, and they talked about these models that can generate but have intractable likelihoods as implicit models. And so my simulator and a GAN are both implicit models. And you see these topics. So in terms of a physics machine learning conference, I think that this is like one of the, like this nexus of ideas is like super compelling to me. I really like this area. And so there have now been a lot of techniques that have been developed in recent years to try to address it. So roughly there's approaches that directly use the simulator in some smart way. And then there are other approaches where you, for instance, try to learn the simulator. You try to transfer the distribution that's implicitly defined by the simulator onto some neural network or something, and then you use that thing for doing inference. And that's like your surrogate. If I can have like a couple minutes, I'll conclude. Yeah, so I don't have time to talk much about them, but I'll just flash something. So probabilistic programming, first this adversarial variational optimization. The idea here was like, let's just set it up like a GAN. I've got a generator. Does it look like my observed data or not? And I'm going to keep adjusting the parameters of my simulator until it looks like the observed data. The problem with this approach is that some simulators are like PDEs, fluid mechanics, things like that, and they're reversible. But a lot of my simulators are not. They have random choices in them that are totally non-differentiable. So I can't differentiate through my simulator. So what do? But you can use the kind of tricks from reinforcement learning, these reinforced gradients, and you can basically backprop through that thing, and then you can tune the simulator. So there's like a generalization of GANs for non-differentiable things, and we've used it, and it works okay. A lot more could be done there. The other approach in probabilistic programming is you reach deep inside of the simulator and you grab all the random number generators, and you like literally are integrating over the latent space that's inside the simulator. So all the random number calls that whatever in Fortran. So we developed a tool, for instance, which is like a protocol between the actual scientific simulator that you already spent 20 years writing, and then a outside like neural network that can kind of reach in and control the random numbers. And basically the idea is either you do some kind of like MC Bayesian inference, or you can do a fancy type of importance sampling where you use a neural network to propose what random numbers should be called, and it controls the execution. But you're doing inference on the space of stack traces. So it's like highly structured, crazy looking space. We, I think, made one of probably the largest LSTMs ever to try to control a physics simulator, and we trained the thing on like thousands of cores at NERSC, and that's like a recent result. This is super heavyweight and not like for the faint of heart, but you could do it. It's interesting. The approaches that seem more scalable are on the kind of like just learn a surrogate. So I'll just say really quickly, instead of GANs and things, there are these other types of generative models that do have a tractable likelihood. So for instance, these autoregressive models like Kungyan was talking about, or like the ones that make this audio.
The avocado is a pear-shaped fruit with leathery skin, smooth edible flesh, and a large stone.
That's pretty impressive audio, right? It's generating it like point by point in time to make that wave file that I just played for you. So like the quality of these things is outstanding. They're slow to generate, so some people don't like them so much. But what's nice about them, here's the same kind of auto-regressive model on the same tree that I was showing you before. It makes jets, they look right, but unlike a GAN, which is like one stop from a bunch of random numbers to the data, this thing has all these intermediate places with latent variables that mean something to me. So here is a plot of like, you go inspect one of those latent variables, and you look at the distribution of like how when a particle decays, its momentum sharing between the real simulator written by physicists and this neural network thing, and it's learning the latent state, like the distribution of the latent state, like accurately, right? And so I can interpret things that are going on inside, which is like, to me, very compelling, right? There are approaches called flows. There are now like convolutional flows, which would be great if you want to make distributions that are translationally invariant and things like that. There's now ideas of these change of variables that are turning into continuous time, so like an infinite number of layers of your neural network, which is basically solving a PDE, which is interesting. Recently, we generalized these idea of flows to quantum mechanical systems so that it's not a distribution, it's like a wave function. Basically, it's just you just take the square root of the Jacobian, and it works out okay. But it will also keep orthonormal states orthonormal, so we can use that to then model entire eigenbasis, and then we can do things like variational inference and maximum likelihood in quantum systems directly, where we're actually modeling a density matrix, and we lift the KL divergence to the quantum relative entropy, but basically it's like maximum likelihood and variational inference just for quantum states. And when we do that, we can, this is taking data, like quantum data, and fitting it, and we extract, like for the simple harmonic oscillator, like the wave functions, right, and the energy level. So this seems pretty exciting. So I don't know. I'll say one last thing, and I'll be done. Is that I haven't said anything about how you train these things. And so when you have the simulator, usually the idea is you run the simulator, you make some observed data, you fit your neural network or something. But since we're physicists and we wrote the simulator, we can do a little bit more. And we realize that even if the simulator is non-differentiable, you can keep track. You can think of the simulator as a policy in the form of like reinforcement learning, all the random choices of the state as it evolves, and you can keep track of things like what would be like the reinforced gradient. But instead of making random choices like on the fly, you just accumulate them, and and then you can regress on this thing, and you can learn like the score function, which is like the optimal sufficient statistic for doing inference in this problem. And so it basically goes from a problem like this, where you had training data, this x-axis is training data from like say 2 values of your simulator. The red curve would be like the Bayes optimal classifier between them. It goes from data that looks like that to data that looks like the stuff on the right, where you have like you're regressing onto a nice continuous function. That's obviously going to be a lot easier to fit. And if you look at, for instance, how sample efficient we are, this is like the estimation error versus training sample size on a logarithmic scale. And with whatever that is, from 10 million to 5,000 training data to get better performance, right? So we can just crush what you would do if you just had samples by being able to essentially evaluate derivatives through the simulator and augment the training data and come up with new objectives to optimize. There's stuff about stochastic optimization, which I won't talk about, for multi-scale problems. And there's stuff about doing experimental design on the fly, which is basically optimizing expected information game of what experiment you should do next by sticking a likelihood-free inference in the loop, which I won't tell you about, but it will tell you what a graduate student learns in particle physics. So I don't know. So my conclusion of all of this is basically that we're going to need to leverage expert knowledge and take advantage of like the generative process, include all sorts of inductive bias if we can. And I don't think we're going to be like replacing physicists. I think it's going to be a very nice hybrid relationship between them. And that's it. Okay, thank you very much. Right.
Gradient along the way using auxiliary variables.
Right.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So basically, here it is a little bit in equations. Is that if I think about, as the generative process is unfolding, at some point I have a state of my code is at some state. I've got some quarks and gluons floating around with some momenta, and then the simulator is going to decide what to do. Like, should they decay or not, right? And so there will be, say, a decision to decay. And that's a non-differentiable decision, right? But once I've made that decision, then I continue going along. So I'm calling Z here all the latent variables in the process to get there, and X is the final output of my simulator. So I have to freeze all the choice, the whole trajectory through the simulator state. What I ask is, if I change the parameters of my model, would those choices have been more or less likely? I don't actually change the path through the simulator because that's non-differentiable. But if I freeze the path, the trajectory in a reinforcement sense, ask like what's the change in the log probability. And I can also do, for instance, a likelihood ratio between two, not just infinitesimally different values, but two very different values. And so then, but these are, this is not what I want. And I can't integrate these things because the integral of the ratio is not the ratio of the integrals, right? And so like for a likelihood ratio, I want the other thing. But it turns out we have this little theorem that that if you do basically just L2 regression on a variable that doesn't depend on the latents, only on the observable, then like you get some kind of miraculous cancellation of Bayes theorem, and you get out like the score or the actual likelihood ratio of the marginal models, which is what you want. And so yeah, that's right, exactly. But that, I mean, I think that's a trick we should just be doing all the time if you can. I mean, it does require that you. And the thing is, how do you do that? Either you have to go back in your code and keep track of those probabilities, or things like Pyro, some of these probabilistic programming languages, they're basically built to do that for you. So like when you get a draw, you can keep the log probability and then run autodiff on that thing, and you augment the data so that every time you put out an output, you also produce these reinforced gradients and things. Yeah, no, I mean, yes, I'm not an expert, but we were having some similar discussions about, I mean, viewing the simulator as a policy, which is not like a learned policy, but it's like a fixed policy with a few parameters, is like a very powerful idea, I think. Yeah.
Go back.
That was number 7.
So I was just wondering what the adjacency matrix showed. Is that the norms of the edges in the graph neural network?
Yeah,
and
the color is basically like the sort of like a notion of distance, right? So
yeah. So is it learning an inverse square force? Is that?
Oh, so in the case of QCD, it's not like they're interacting gravitationally.
Oh yeah,
or
yeah, yeah. Okay.
But there's this notion of what's also interesting. What is the meaning of this? There's this Dij thing or Di prime. This is all through the QCD literature, and it's kind of motivated in a somewhat heuristic way. And I think what it turns out what's nice to think about is that quantity is monotonically related to the probability of one particle splitting. So like somehow close by means high probability of that splitting. And then it turns out, if you look at it in that lens, that this whole like 15-year history of jet reconstruction algorithms are nothing but greedy search on the latent process. And like we should replace that with like beam search and Viterbi algorithms and all that stuff. And it's what's interesting is it's totally classical physics. There's no deep learning involved. And just that insight like makes you look at jets in a totally different way. So
and so on. But it looks like the situation is even worse for GAN because it looks like they don't sample the probability distribution. There was a nice example by Arthur Slam. He was taking all the bedrooms database and looking at, so in this bedroom database, 15% of the image contain a human. And 100% of the realizations of the GAN have no humans inside. No humans, no person. So with no humans. So which shows that it doesn't sample the probability distribution, whatever it is. That's called mode dropping.
Yeah, or mode collapse, right?
So how do you incorporate that? Because obviously it doesn't sample your distribution.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think partially when you're working in those incredibly high dimensional spaces, that's going to be very, very difficult, right? So partially it's because the data is not filling the whole space, and you have this data manifold kind of optimal transport issue. But the other part is you haven't imposed any kind of structure. So like, for instance, if you compare it with this approach, this autoregressive approach, it's still going to try to sample like the space of the data. But what's interesting is you've decomposed it into these little individual splits. And those are like 5 or 6 dimensional distributions. And I even kind of know what they should look like. And I know what symmetries they have. Like that is like the chance that you make a very high dimensional distribution by this composition seems much more believable.